And a very good evening and welcome to CDU Presents, the next in an ongoing series of webinars on topics important to all of us as people of faith, as Catholics, but especially those of us who are connected with the Catholic Distance University. I'm Matthew Bunson. I am the faculty liaison for Catholic Distance University, and I'm very delighted to have a conversation tonight on the steadfastness in faith. To be steadfast in faith in the midst of secularism. And I'm joined tonight by David Bonagura. We're going to be focusing on the issue of faith and secularism, in particular, as a result of his new book, Steadfast in Faith, Catholicism and the Challenges of Secularism, published by Clooney Media in January of just this year. Also joining us tonight, in fact, he has just appeared. Your timing, as always, Pete, is miraculous. It is Dr. Peter Brown, who is our academic dean here at Catholic Distance University. By way of a little bit of background, though, David Bonagura is an adjunct professor of classical languages at St. Joseph Seminary, and also, of course, an adjunct professor of Catholic Distance University. He's the author, as I mentioned, of one of the books that we're going to be talking about tonight. And again, that title is Steadfast in Faith, Catholicism and the Challenges of Secularism. All of us are aware of the immense challenges being posed to faith, to religion across the board by the different aspects of secularism in culture. I'm reminded especially of the emphasis placed upon secularism by Pope Benedict XVI. All of us remember in 2005 his memorable homily. We're going to talk a little bit about that later. Just before his election as Pope Benedict XVI, when he was still Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, and he spoke of the dictatorship of relativism. What does secularism and relativism have in common? But to start us off tonight, I want to read just very briefly from the introduction to David's book. He writes that faith in Jesus Christ has encountered opposition from the very beginning. All but one of Jesus' apostles suffered violent deaths because they professed Jesus' name and taught others to do the same. But then he goes on to note that today new opponents, infatuated with themselves and with the technocratic power at their disposal, are assailing not just Christianity itself, but also any expression of belief in God. I think that's a great table setter for our conversation tonight. I again welcome all of you to this webinar. David, good evening.
Good evening, Matthew. Great to talk to you.
And Pete, welcome as always.
Hi, Matt. How you doing?
Very well. Well, thank to all of you for joining us tonight. We would like you to participate in this webinar this evening. I know you have questions and comments on secularism and the concerns that we all have for where we might be headed in culture. If you look to the right of your screen, you will see in the upper corner an opportunity right there in the dashboard, so to speak, places where you can actually post your questions. Throughout the evening, I will be fielding your questions and sort of on your behalf for our panel tonight. But as we always say, let's just get started with the most basic question of all, and that's to you, David. What exactly do we mean by secularism?
When we take the word secular, secular in and of itself just means related to the world. So for instance, those of you who know the prayer in Latin, the Glory be to the Father in Latin, it ends per in omnia gloria Patri, Filii et Spiritui Sancto, sicut erat in principio, it was in the beginning, et nunc, and now, et semper, and always, in saecula saeculorum. Amen. Literally, that means into the ages of ages. So saeculum, coming from Latin, it simply means time, but for us in contemporary English, it means belonging to the world. And baseball is a secular activity and a perfectly good and holy one of my favorites, in fact. And countless of other activities are secular, belonging to the world. But when we say secularism, that means the ism is the belief part. That's the belief that only what belongs to the world should be constitutive of our being, meaning that's what the stuff that, and the only stuff that we can use to base our politics on, to base our culture on, to base our schools on, and to base our way of living as Americans, not just Americans, but also in the world at large. So when we say secularism, That's the belief that everything that we do needs to be measurable of some kind within this world. It's got to be this world and visible and not extraordinary, not supernatural, not invisible. When we profess the creed on Sunday, we say, believe in all things visible and invisible. Those who espouse the philosophy of secularism, they only believe in the visible, not the invisible.
Now, where would that place us, for example, in a field like positivism?
Positivism would declare that only what we can feel or see and measure is real. So secularism would probably is a broader umbrella into which positivism would stand. Positivism is a specific way of saying, how do we know stuff? But a positivist by nature is also going to be a secularist, meaning he's going to say, or she is going to say, it's only this world that matters, because the only things that we can measure are things that are of earthly, or say gravitational pull, things of that nature, but we can't measure God. We can't measure angels. We can't measure the Holy Spirit. So for the positivist and for the secularist, those things are off the table. They might as well not exist.
But it's kind of striking, is it, that one of the arguments you can make is that it's very difficult to quantify scientifically love.
Yes, exactly. I have a little point on that in the book, and I spent some time early on in the book exploring exactly that. Is that the statement, only what belongs to this world is real and substantive for our being. You can't prove that statement. That's a statement of faith, meaning you're trusting, you're making a reasoned judgment, an inference, but nevertheless, it's not one that's based on any scientific proof to say that. It's an assertion, just like saying that I believe in one God, Father, Son, and Spirit, is an assertion, which is made on good evidence from the revelation of God himself, but nevertheless, it's an assertion. There's no proof in the way that we could add 2 and 2 to make 4. There's no proof in the rational sense of God's existence or any of the things that we believe. Otherwise, it wouldn't require faith. You'd just be forced to know these things. So I think that's the thing that I try to point out in the first part of the book, is that so many of these claims that secularists make, and they don't necessarily need to be the militant ones, even just reading the New York Times every day, as I tend to do, you'll see that secular worldview, that they only will take what's in front of them. But their claims are just as much faith claims as ours. So then the question is, if the secular claims are faith claims and our religious claims are faith claims, which one do we like better? Which one's the better argument? And I would submit that the faith-based argument is the better argument, because it's the one that speaks more completely to what it means to be a human being, including what is love. How does a secularist respond to that? I really don't know. Why should I get up in the morning? What's the secularist response to that? I don't know. I mean, you could, I got to pay bills, I got to put food on the table, I got to pay my kids' college tuition. But if you keep cycling that back, at some point, all right, why am I here? I spent some time in the book talking, in a serious way, engaging Richard Dawkins. And one of the things he says very curiously is that why questions about why this, why that, are silly questions. Quote, they have no meaning. Why questions are the most fundamental ones to our existence. My 2.5-year-old daughter, why, all the time. We want answers. That's how we're made. And to deny that there are reasons for being is really to deny our very nature, which is one of the reasons why I submit that the faith-based argument for the meaning of life and for why we're here is a better one, because it really speaks to the truth of who we are. The secularist one really is not only it's unfulfilling, it's also just impractical when it comes to saying, what am I doing as a human being here?
Well, there always seems to be a kind of working assumption that a secularist must, by definition, also be either an atheist or, at the very least, an agnostic. So what's the relationship between those concepts and being a secularist?
I think it's possible to be a believer and a secularist in the sense that, I don't want religion to have anything to do with anything in public life. It's probably possible to say that. And probably someone who says that is probably not the most fervent of religious believers. But certainly those who are atheists and those who are agnostic, they don't they're professing straight up that they're not into religion. So naturally, their argument is going to be, oh, I'm a secularist. I don't like religion, so therefore I don't want it. And that's how you see it played out. For instance, in Maryland, it's argued before the Supreme Court just yesterday, a gargantuan cross that's in a cemetery, a war memorial from World War I, if I'm not mistaken. Mm-hmm. And there are secularists who have challenged that its existence in court. They're saying that it's a state, because it's a state-run cemetery on state grounds. So the argument of the secularists is that this is the state-sponsored religion. That we've come that far, that a big cross as a memorial is dismissed because at least by some, because it's a sign of faith. That's scary. That shows the state of where we are in our country right now.
Mm-hmm. Pete, do you want to chime in here?
Sure. So I think the book talks a little bit about the Enlightenment, and I'd like to go back to the term you introduced a minute ago, Matthew, the term positivism. That probably captures the totality of the Enlightenment agenda more than anything. What's interesting about the Enlightenment is it's a many variegated thing. Not everyone in the Enlightenment, and I say not even that many people, have the view of Richard Dawkins that why questions are irrelevant or you're not allowed to ask them. But going back to the idea of positivism, positivism has the root word posit. So if you and I decide to have a discussion about something, we sort of have ground rules of our discussion, right? So if Matthew and I want to talk about, say, history, say, what caused World War I, World War II, we might posit that, well, we're going to leave the ultimate causality of God out of the equation because, we can probably satisfactorily explain World War II, in the normal ebb and flow of historical causality just by saying, well, there was never a really satisfactory solution to the conflict of World War I. You had the economic instability, Hitler rose. So we're sort of posit that we'll exclude the kind of questions of ultimate causality, and God's role in the universe, and just look at history sort of as a self-contained unit. That positivism is really sort of the dominant force of the Enlightenment, which pervades everywhere from the academy to, even the church in many places, in the media, in the ways educated people talk about the world. It's not so much an overt denial of God or an overt hostility toward God, although you do see that sort of manifestation occasionally. It's just a sort of habit of mind in which we don't necessarily insist that you exclude God, from all things in life, or insist that God doesn't exist or behave as though God doesn't exist, but it's that you have the sort of ground rules of thought parameters in the discussion where you have to sort of bracket questions of God, as being sort of off limits to this particular discussion. And of course, as we move on through the centuries, with this assumption, you get more and more fields of just knowledge and endeavor that in effect bracket the supernatural completely. That's the force of positivism. And of course, as I think David would agree, that kind of over time tends to slide into not just a sort of an assumption that you have about evaluating the world. It might be useful to do astronomy without thinking too much about angels, the possibility that angels actually push the planets, or saying doing history without thinking of God's interventions in history. But if that habit of mind becomes so pervasive, and this is one of the reasons it's so hard to counter, I think, for us, is that it does tend to have this crowd out phenomenon where questions of God or the ultimate questions of who we are, where we came from, and where we're going, are so pushed to the margins of life that if we can't bring them up in biology, we can't bring them up in science, we can't bring them up in history. We've sort of posited them away in those discussions. Where can you bring them up? And then, of course, from there, it is much easier to slide into, the sort of hard edge Richard Dawkins view that, these questions are not allowed, they're not important at all.
Right.
It's in some sense a very small step to get to that point. But you see, that step is only possible when you have, many centuries of habits of thought in which questions of the supernatural, ultimate teleological questions of where we've come from and where we're headed are, not in effect denied or rejected, but just bracketed as being, well, let's just posit that these questions are not questions that we can discuss or resolve right now. We're never going to be able to come to an agreement on those anyway. Let's just talk about the things we can talk about, and these are the things right before us right now. And so that's really kind of what we're dealing with. And I think that has turned out to be a very, very hard problem for us to, a tough nut to crack, because in effect, this is the way we do history too, right? I've taken your history courses, Matthew, and, we don't always talk, you don't talk about God a lot in terms of what God is doing in terms of this push or pull, right, or this particular event, right? So you've in effect agreed to the ground rules that in some sense the Enlightenment has set, and for good reasons. I mean, historians just don't talk about history in terms of ultimate questions of causality or divine governance of the world. But this has become a very, very difficult problem for us to get a foothold in, I think, and we're sort of on a slippery slope now where, in some sense we're trying to answer Richard Dawkins, and we might be able to answer Richard Dawkins, but doing history again in bringing back questions of divine causality, that's a really hard thing to do. I think we need to think long and hard about how we might do that. How do we get out of positivism? How do we get out from under it?
Well, it strikes me too that part of the aspect of dealing with it, as you note, Pete, is establishing a common vocabulary, which we seem to have lost to some degree. And those secularists that we're talking about, in many ways, have gained the high ground for language, and also as a result of that, pushing religion, pushing belief out of the public square. And toward that end, David, Pope Benedict XVI, as I referenced right at the start of our conversation tonight, the concept of the dictatorship of relativism. Why is it, for example, that we frequently see that the secularist agenda ultimately leads to a kind of silencing or censoring of those of belief in wider culture? We're seeing that somewhat in the United States. We're certainly seeing it in parts of Europe.
Well, I think what's happened is that and Pete just made a very good distinction between the regular people dealing with the world as it's been handed to us versus the more militant people of the ilk of Richard Dawkins. And I think it's people who maybe be not as articulate or as forceful as Dawkins, but nevertheless who have that worldview. They're the ones who are in Hollywood. They're the ones who are publishing the newspapers and the television, running the television stations. So in many respects, that's what sets what we talk about. And when they're talking about secular things, that's one thing. But when they're going after religion aggressively, such as these few men who brought this lawsuit against a simple cemetery monument that's been sitting for decades, just because they want to prove a point. And when they're on offense and when we're on defense, when the instinct becomes to clam up and defend, it becomes so much harder than to articulate, because we're worried about just being able to do our own thing, hold our own ground. When they keep coming and we keep getting assaults of that kind, when religious movies aren't supported at the box office, or when there's other religious things out there that don't get the same traction in the culture as secular things do, and also as we're seeing just in the last few months with our church, when the religious side of things messes up, it gives them just another weapon to keep coming at us. And I think that's why we're constantly on the defensive mode. And so one of the goals in writing the book was to say, we need to be able to answer their questions, yes, but at the same time, we don't need to be on defense all the time, because if we consider our own view, our own worldview as a people of faith in its totality, we have the better argument. The question then is, can we find ways to take the high ground, to use the example you just gave? Is there a way that we can seize that from those who are attacking religion, and maybe not necessarily attack secularism back, but can we make faith look attractive again? Can we make people want to celebrate Christmas, not just by giving gifts and buying stuff, but wanting to go to church, not just going to church, but wanting to go and wanting to celebrate what the mystery of Christmas is all about? If we can get a way to make that point, find a way to do that, I hope we'd be able to reclaim some of that contested ground that you mentioned.
Yeah, Pete, by way of helping people understand a little bit about how secularism can sort of creep into the realm of faith, the realm of religion, it strikes me that just a brief discussion of the way we analyze, the way we do exegesis of Scripture, which is now very politically charged, might be worthwhile at this point.
Yeah, it sure is. Yeah, that's really a whole nother discussion of the influence of positivism on and secularism on biblical exegesis. Yeah, so what's the primary effect of positivism and secularism on biblical exegesis? Well, you still end up interpreting the Bible, right? You still end up, reading it and trying to make sense of it, but you're trying to make sense of it in effect by bracketing out the sort of questions of its supernatural origin or its positive present day claim on us, and treating it more as simply a work of history. And indeed, there are things to learn from treating it as a work of history, and that's one of the reasons why it's like with a lot of things, it's difficult to really combat, and I'm not sure we want to completely combat it or root it out, because secularists or secularism, or to just throw around terminology, they are the people who developed a lot of skills and tools and of analyzing ancient documents, and these tools and skills are very useful. Learning ancient languages, learning the ways in which ancient language can convey meaning, the historical events surrounding these things. All of these things are they're not alien to the church before the age of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, but they definitely took on a really central character at that time, and we actually have learned a lot more about the Bible from that. But of course, the problem with it is that with the same thing you do is if you bracket out the kind of supernatural aspect of divine authorship of the Bible and simply look at the human authorship, and then of course the Bible becomes simply a work of history with no more claim on us than the Iliad or the Odyssey does. I mean, it can be inspiring, we can learn from it, but why read the Bible and not just the Iliad, the Odyssey, or the Enuma Elish or any other ancient work? You know what I'm saying? So the problem is again that this kind of bracketing out phenomenon, which we've seen, which is something we're fighting against, but it's hard to do because the people bracketing it out have things that we've learned from themselves too. Just like in the realm of natural sciences, the bracketing out secularist positive crowd has contributed a lot to human knowledge, and therefore we can't get rid of them. We don't want to entirely get rid of them, but the problem is that we're trying to affirm that while at the same time say, yeah, okay, this knowledge is there, it's real, it's valid, but we need to figure out a way to affirm this without allowing God and teleology and God's purpose for us and God's voice in the world today to be sort of drowned out of the discussion. That's the fundamental problem we're dealing with, and it's in some ways no different with biblical interpretation than it is with the role of faith in natural sciences, and the role of faith, or the role of secularism in natural science, the role of secularism in history.
Would it be safe to say, and this is for both of you, that the current methods of literary historical criticism have their roots in Enlightenment thinking?
Well, certainly. Peter, you're far better to speak on Scripture than I am. But just to speak more broadly, when we talk about the scientific enterprise in general, people often forget that the church was the creator of the university. The church was one of the leading supporters of science, in Europe for centuries. We have dozens of craters on the moon that are discovered and named for Jesuit astronomers. And when they were doing that endeavor, they weren't doing that in say, oh, I'm going to try to find God in the crater. That's not. Oh, the understanding is God is behind all. God created all this, and He said, go explore, use your natural reason. That's what it's for. It's a great thing. Go try to figure out what I've given to you. So there's nothing wrong with using those things, and they're good and helpful to us. But if we use them in such a way, and this is the danger, and I think this is what happens if you trace Enlightenment thought through the centuries, is we yield to the temptation of, oh, if I can think about this without God, I can think about this without God. Maybe I don't need to, and maybe I don't need a God at all. And maybe I don't need God at all because maybe there isn't a God. So that we can follow down that road, which is certainly a very dangerous road to walk down. Whereas the Catholic approach is simply use the tools. They're wonderful. But don't forget the author behind the tools, whom you cannot see and whom you cannot measure. Right. Here, don't you worry.
Right, so, and all of the modern, tools of science, and in terms of biblical interpretation, had their roots within Christendom, even well before the various secularists of different species. And I hate to throw around the term secularist and Enlightenment thinkers, because Enlightenment is an incredibly complicated phenomenon, and it's a gross oversimplification to say that the Enlightenment is hostile to Christianity. It's not always hostile to Christianity, as it does accept the sort of bracketing phenomenon that I'm talking about. And so there are many thinkers in the Enlightenment who've challenged and sought a way to have Christian ideas find a different sort of a foothold maybe than what they had in the Middle Ages. So it's good that we don't oversimplify the discussion also, because, as I say, not everyone is Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins is sort of one guy, and he might have a rather loud voice, and maybe he has a larger following today than what some, the equivalent of Richard Dawkins did, 200 years ago, 300 years ago. But these things tend to come and ebb and flow, and I suspect that a lot of people who are gravitating to Richard Dawkins now, the reason that they're doing it, they're already looking for an excuse to, forget the ultimate questions in life, maybe because they don't really want to think about the ultimate questions in life, maybe because the ultimate questions in life might really force them to ask questions of themselves, and a lot of people don't want to do that, and so you consequently gravitate toward philosophies that sort of banish those questions at the outset. So, but the questions have a habit of coming back again, and it's just because Richard Dawkins is around hardly means that the questions that David is posing are gone.
Right. Well, to the very point of philosophies, David. We started our conversation tonight with the term positivism, but if we look a little further, I think, for example, with David Hume, empiricism, skepticism, terms that the average person probably doesn't really ponder intently. I doubt very many people have read David Hume on a regular basis, and yet we seem to be living in a culture that embraces the concepts of skepticism and empiricism. So what do we mean by those, and how did those play into the gradual secularization of society?
Empiricism pertains to that which we can measure by some sort of scale, whether it be a ruler, whether it be a weight scale, whether it be the way we measure gravitational waves and other things like that. Empiricism is something that we can measure. Skepticism is the approach where it's a little bit of a simplification, but we're assuming that whatever we hear is false. We say, oh, I'm skeptical about that claim when my coworker came in and said that he was riding a horse through Madrid, Spain over the weekend while I was pulling weeds out of my backyard. Oh, gee, that doesn't sound right. So we have that, and it's natural to have a good bit of skepticism in us. We all do. It's a natural defense mechanism to keep us and help us discern what is true and what is not. But when we take skepticism as our foundational point of view, where we're going to say, I'm going to doubt everything that I hear, or when it comes to God, I'm skeptical. That person is immediately, take that claim or that statement, that person has shut himself off from the possibility of God being in the world, of God working in his life. That's our approach in the beginning. I'm skeptical. Right away, it's standoffish. I don't want to hear whatever it is that you have to say to me about this God stuff. I don't believe it. So we have skepticism and we have empiricism, and they run hand in hand, because the skeptic does want to, naturally we want to cling to some sort of knowledge. Empiricism is easy because we can measure something and say, oh, look, here it is. And that's natural. Oh, I gained 5 pounds over the week. Ash Wednesday's coming. I need to lose some weight. We can measure those things, and that gives us some comfort, and we can point to them. It's with the realm of faith, and with the realm of philosophy too, where we can't measure things. Then it becomes more difficult. Our ground becomes more contested. And there's some people they don't want to get involved, so they say, I don't need that stuff. I'm skeptical. I'll just deal with what I got in front of me. That's the empiricist.
Yeah. Well, a real quick question, because I think it kind of connects to this. Rick asks, in asserting God and the supernatural against secularist attack, should we not harness more scientifically and historically verified accounts of miracles, apparitions, and other supernatural interventions? After all, even in our Lord's ministry, as stated in John 2:11, his disciples began to believe him only after the miracle of Cana. And in the church's beginnings, the most powerful force for winning converts is the eyewitness testimonies of the resurrection and the miracles performed by our Lord and his disciples. Interesting question.
Certainly. And miracles, Jesus himself points to his miracles. He says it to Philip in the Last Supper in the upper room. He says, you don't believe that the Father is in me? Well, then believe the works that he does through me. So Jesus himself is constantly pointing to his signs. But forget all of us in this world, and whether it be Richard Dawkins or people in between, Jesus' own contemporaries saw the miracles, and they didn't deny that something wondrous happened, but they denied that, they at least didn't want to make the inference that Jesus was divine. So, oh, they blame Beelzebub, or, oh, nothing good can come from Nazareth. This can't be, isn't this the carpenter's son? He can't do this sort of thing.
Yeah.
So the miracles themselves, they're the sign, but they don't coerce belief the way mathematics and measuring science coerce belief. So it's important to point to the miracles. Jesus himself did it. And we have Fatima, and we have countless of other miracles. But someone who takes a skeptical worldview or certainly skeptical of religious things, is just not going to want to hear it. Richard Dawkins is one of them. They've closed themselves off to the possibility. Those of us who witnessed the miracle, we could just simply, if we saw the sun dance at Fatima 100 years ago, we could say, that could have been caused by X, Y, or Z. And we could, we don't know the science yet. One of these days we'll know. So the miracles themselves don't force belief. Otherwise, belief wouldn't be faith. Belief would be certain knowledge. So there's a difference there. As important as the miracles are, if someone like Richard Dawkins, and he says this, and I mentioned this in the book, if someone writes Richard Dawkins is outright closed to the possibility of God intervening in the world, then all the points, all the miracles, and all the wondrous healings will do little good if he's got the hard heart. That's the key, right? If today you hear his voice, harden not your heart. Only if we soften our hearts and want to hear God's voice can we then be open to the possibility of miracles moving us to belief.
Yeah. Pete, you want to add something to that?
Yeah, so there's a whole bunch here. So I sometimes don't know whether a book like this, or just like in miracles in general, are really designed so much to convert the skeptic as they are to give reassurance to the believer. And I think in some ways, as I think David in some ways has said there, miracles kind of have that role. Are people converted historically by miracles? Yeah, I suppose it happens. But I think, David said before that our Lord Jesus in the Gospel of John once said, if you don't believe that I'm from the Father, at least believe in the works. Well, there are plenty of people who don't believe he's from the Father and don't believe in the works. So what's the third option there? So where do we go from there at that point? And so the second question would be with that is how do we actually answer this? And I think in some ways, we may not answer it, right? I mean, there's only so much you can do through logos, right? There's only so much you can do through rational argumentation. Many people are converted. Some people, I suppose, are converted through rational argumentation. But I think in many cases, if you look at most people's conversions, there's a lot more. There's a lot more of emotional types of things going on. There's more of sort of a human need that they had that was felt that was felt and found, by people who were already in a kind of a loving, accepting Christian community. And they found God that way, rather than through, sort of demonstratio or arguments or proofs. And I don't know. I mean, what will convert the world again? Will it be arguments against the atheist? Will it be a detailed point-by-point fisking a refutation of Richard Dawkins, or will it be just sort of heroic acts of love and really creating a plausibility for a love that is truly beyond rational bounds, that makes no sense in human or worldly terms? That's the kind of thing I think that might actually have a shot at it over the long haul. But I'm just sort of, I've grown a little skeptical in my middle age that we can really win these arguments through rational argumentation. Doesn't mean we shouldn't try, but as David points out, if Richard Dawkins probably won't be persuaded by David's book if he reads it, and evidence through Fatima miracles, through the Saint Januarius miracle of the blood that liquefies every year, or Eucharistic miracles. I don't know. I mean, maybe, but I think that probably conversion is really a more of a supernatural thing than that, and a much more mysterious thing than that.
Yeah. Well, David, first, I hope you send a copy of your book to Mr. Dawkins. It might do him some good. But
the book is not written for him, and for it's not written so much to make conversions, but to support those of us who already believe.
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah. Question.
Right. Exactly.
What's the speed of the church? It's not books and rational argumentation. It's the blood of the martyrs. It's heroic witness. It's seemingly irrational love for this power and this person whom we can't see, but nevertheless is worthy of our very lives. That's the power of real witness. And if we're going to reclaim the culture, we're certainly going to need that. But we also need to be able to make a defense of when we are called upon, as St. Peter tells us in his letter. So we do need to know our stuff as well. And I think simply we need to know we're not crazy. Because when Richard Dawkins gives his reasons for denying the miracle of Fatima, he doesn't really know the answer as to why it happened. So he's making a faith claim. Just like we said, we believe that God caused the sun to dance. Well, he believes that there's some sort of science thing out there that helped him, that one day will explain that. That's a faith claim. It's just like ours. Which one do you want to believe? That's what I would challenge Richard Dawkins with, is your claims are you're masquerading behind science, but so much of what the secularists have to say is based on faith faith in their worldview. And I just don't think it's as a persuasive argument as our worldview.
Well, you've hit, in fact, on my very next question, which has to do with the fact that when we read someone like the late Christopher Hitchens, who was an ardent atheist, who did his best, for example, to demean and even slander Mother Teresa, Saint Mother Teresa. But one of his arguments was that at the end of the day, a secular atheist regime like North Korea or the Soviet Union was actually more religion than it was philosophy or secular atheism. Now, it's an odd argument to make, it seems to me, but I'm struck by the fact that secularism in ardent advocates, in the hands of those like Richard Dawkins and others, has assumed in culture a kind of religious cult atmosphere itself. And is that one of the ways that it has proven to be very pervasive in culture, in the fact that it has assumed, at least in its approach to dealing with culture, an almost religion-like cultic aspect?
Yes, I mean, many commentators have called secularism itself as not just the North Korean example, but the own secularism that we encounter here in this country as a form of religion with a dogma. Now, here's an example. 2 years ago, when the first women's marches were organized in the major cities in our country, pro-life feminist groups applied to have a table and a display in the midst of these marches in Washington, D.C. and New York City. They were denied that by the organizers of the Women's March. Why is that? Because the dogma of the secularism that they were expounding says abortion is a natural right, and therefore your pro-life view is anathema. It's heresy to us. Don't bring it here. We don't want it in our secular church. And those are the ones who are denying our religion, but at the same time, they've built up their own creeds of what it means to be secular and therefore how the world should work. And they are completely intolerant of other worldviews, and they seek to impose those views on the rest of us. That's exactly the vocabulary that they use against us. He who wins the language war wins the culture war. And it seems like the secularists has won, or at least has the high ground on the language war at the time being, because they call it, oh, don't impose your beliefs on us. I'm a New Yorker, and we just had signed the law last month by our Catholic governor, a horrific expansion of abortion on demand up to the 9th month of pregnancy. And our Catholic governor, just like his father, Catholic governor before him, said that, oh, I don't impose my religious beliefs on anyone. Well, he's imposing his secular beliefs on the rest of us, and it's not for the best. And what about the rest of us? Our beliefs don't matter, but his do, just because his don't come from religion. So they really have succeeded in soiling the religious approach. I mean, we're always on the defensive in the last 2, 3, 4 decades in this country when it comes to making arguments in the public square. Where once upon a time you could make a religious religious-based argument for something that's practical. Slavery was abolished by religious argumentation. Civil rights was advanced by religious argumentation, religious-based argumentation. We use religion to say that God created us all equally, and so therefore that should be the foundation for our policies and how we treat one another. Nowadays, we're not allowed to bring those. So where would the civil rights movement be without the Bible, without Christianity? Where would the women's movement be, the initial movement, without the Bible and Christianity?
Well, I'm struck.
It wouldn't be a good place, I don't think.
Well, I'm struck in some ways that the argument that along those very lines would be a tougher sell today, because they're not really allowed by secular society to invoke something like a higher power, a creator, who made all of us in his image and likeness, and therefore we are endowed with innate human dignity.
Exactly. They've managed to expunge it from the public square. It's now it's heresy in American parlance. It's heresy. So we can't make those religious arguments. Where every argument has to come from somewhere. No one argues ex nihilo. Each of us, even if we're bringing our opinions on what we think our respective baseball teams are going to be able to do in the coming season, that it's not coming from a vacuum. We've looked at our rosters. We've looked at what's happening in spring training. We've taken account for the injuries that already may have occurred. Oh, the Mets are going to win 88 games this year, and they're going to take the National League East. From my lips to God's ears, I hope. But
it strikes me as unlikely, but go ahead.
Yes, correct, exactly. It strikes me as unlikely as well. Another faith claim. But those arguments, they come from somewhere. People just make them up. But they're arguments about, use that example. It's an argument about baseball. If my religion informs my opinion about the team, oh fine. As long as I can get to batting averages and ERA, well then that's fine. Where it doesn't make a difference where my philosophy is. I'm into analytic baseball or I'm into old school baseball. It doesn't matter. Once you get to baseball, that's where it counts. Same thing. When we go into politics, it doesn't make a difference if your theory comes from religion or it comes from secularism. What counts is when we get into the public arena with the practicalities, what does that mean? And I would submit that since our Catholic worldview is a more complete one that speaks more truly to the human person, the policies that we derive from that are going to be better ones because they come from a better place. Good soil brings good plants. Usually that's the case. Not always, but usually that's the case.
Yeah. Well, let me turn to a quick question here from a member of our audience. That's Rick, who is asking the question that point taken that hardcore atheists would not even care to hear scientific and historical proofs of the supernatural, but really the real target for preaching are doubters and believers who just need to hear solid evidence. For such people, accounts of stringently validated miracles and sainthood processes, at least 2 for every saint, would be persuasive, don't you think?
I agree 100%.
Yeah.
100%. And there's some of that in the book, in the chapter 3 on the existence of God. For the person who's in the pew and is having issues that we all have because of the nature of faith itself, yes, though that's why God gives us these miracles, the ones that Jesus did in his own lifetime, and all the ones that have occurred since, the intercession of saints, the Eucharistic miracles that Pete mentioned before, the apparitions of Our Lady. Those are all exactly meant to support us in our faith.
Yeah, and as someone over the years who's been involved with a number of causes of canonization from the technical side, I can also vouch that for anyone who investigates miracles or who hopes that a miracle is going to be approved by, for example, the Congregation for the Causes of Saints, that the medical requirements for the validation of a miracle are pretty remarkable in the sense that you have to have a board of doctors who are explaining or have to testify that this is literally medically beyond explanation. Now, what that means for a lot of secularists, it's simply insufficient. But for a board often made up of non-Catholic physicians, their testimony is pretty striking. And then when you read miracles that are working, that have been approved, it truly is inexplicable just from an empirical or positive this standpoint. Would you agree with that?
Definitely.
Yeah.
So that's a good thing. It wants us to try to give us as much reason for hope and faith as possible.
So it strikes me that there is that potential relationship then between faith and reason, that there's a lot more ground in common than people might initially think.
Yes, the Catholics have always had faith in reason, and that's it was very important in Pope Benedict's pontificate. He talked a lot about that. Pope John Paul II dedicated an entire encyclical to this topic. We like science. We like reason as Catholics because that's how we're made as human beings. And the two are meant to go together. To use Pope John Paul's image, faith and reason are two wings that together rise up to contemplate the mystery of God. When we think about Scripture, and when you say taking classes here at CDU, you're using the rational side of your brains to exercise your faith. They complement each other. And the churches always hold these two things together, that they're like faith and reason working together is like a compass. And
Yeah.
one of the problems that our secular world has is it's particularly the skeptic does not have faith in reason. The skeptic has denied the fact that, oh, maybe reason can't work. Maybe I can't really know anything. So in order for reason to work properly, we have to have faith in that too. It's like Descartes. We could say, oh, yeah, maybe this is all a dream, this world here, and I don't know if it's all real or not. Well, he doesn't have faith in reason. We have faith in God, but we also have faith in reason, that it works, that when we say things about the world, it's meaningful. And when we stub our toe, that's a real experience of pain. It's not just, oh, gee, this is a figment of my imagination, as some philosophers may hold. But faith and reason go together for Catholics, always have and always will.
Mm-hmm. Well, another question from the audience. We're getting quite a few tonight. This is from Christine, who says that not everyone is equipped with enough knowledge about both secularism and the faith. What kind of question we ask from a non-defensive position? That's a very good question.
It is a good question. What can we ask them? Is that the question?
Yeah, I think what kind of questions can we ask from a non-defensive position? And so, in other words, I'm assuming that what we're talking about is when we're in dialogue with secularists, and oftentimes that can be somebody who's grown up with faith, but then has left the faith and has embraced a secular position. And but for example, someone like Richard Dawkins, what are some of the questions that we can ask that would be relevant to the average person today?
The first question I would ask if someone tells me they don't believe in God, and I think this is the best question to ask. Well, what is the God that you don't believe in? That would be my first question. What is the God that you do not believe in? You know, I don't believe in the God who, shakes his fist at us, every time we do evil. I don't believe in the God who gets involved in details and then retreats to this lofty land in heaven and blah, 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 blah,
What was that phrase from, was it Bruce Almighty, oh, smite me, oh, mighty smiter?
Yeah, exactly.
Right,
And
yeah.
so, well, that's great. I don't believe in that God either. The God I believe in is Jesus of Nazareth. Let me tell you about him, right? And sort of keep the question not so much around argumentation, but around telling a story. And I think the essence of preaching the gospel is about telling a story. It's not about so much fallacy hunting or finding holes in arguments or that sort of thing. It's about telling a convincing story of the world, that we have a world, that there are fundamental problems in the world. There's a certain screwed upness about the world. We know that it's screwed up because we sense that it is. We always sense there's something wrong with the world, right? Even the social justice warriors think that. Richard Dawkins thinks that, I'm sure.
And we all somehow manage to have a pretty good hand in making it so.
Exactly. And so that the creator of the world has sent his son into the world to fix the problems of the world and ultimately rejoin the world to himself, and that, and bringing out a people who is consecrated to him. So what about that? So I hear your secularism. I hear you're not sure whether God's really creator, but what about the story? And ultimately kind of ask them questions about, what it is they don't believe in, and ground the faith as much as possible in a narrative and in a person, right? Because ultimately our faith is not in doctrines. Our faith is in a person that the doctrines themselves all in some way speak to, and fundamentally a story about how the world is the way that it is and where the world's ultimately going. And if we can't tell the story and ground it in a person, the arguments that we make are not going to really do any good. So that's really, I think, where I focus on myself if I come across an unbeliever. What God is it you don't believe in? Because chances are it's a God that's nothing at all like the God that I do believe in. So there's actually ground for discussion there.
Yeah, and do you find, David, that in so many cases, someone who is a secularist started off in a family of belief, but lost that somewhere along the line, perhaps, and we haven't really talked about it quite yet. I'd like to turn to that a bit. lost their faith because of scandals in the church, because of what they saw as a horrendous example of their parents, or some crisis in their life. I'm always struck by the fact that so many secularists and atheists at one point were believers, who left, but you can see in your discussions with them that it's still down there somewhere.
Well, that's the great thing about the faith, is that when we're baptized, that mark is always there, and we could bury it, and we could try to forget that it's there, and you think of the prodigal son and all that loose living that he did. But at the end of the day, he came home, and the reason why he came home is because there was something there that told him that he should go back. For us as Catholics, it's our baptism. That's our eternal sign of hope, that even for the the atheist, or the one who becomes a skeptic and wanders away, or the one who is scandalized by the evil that he sees, whether it be in the world in general or perpetrated by the leaders of our church, there's something greater there. And one way that we could read the Bible from beginning to end, not just the New Testament, but the whole thing, is this through the lens of, boy, aren't humans stupid. God keeps opening the door, he establishes a covenant, and every single one of his prophets fails him. Moses, the greatest of the prophets, doubts him. Peter denies him. Augustine, we can go, St. Paul was authorizing the murder of people, of anyone who espoused Jesus' name. Yet somehow these people turned around and became the greatest believers. So the church is not the church the perfect. I think that's important to keep in mind. Number one is that the church doesn't exist to make us perfect beings. It exists to make us holy. And then what did Jesus say when he was with us? Is that he wasn't like the Pharisees, who didn't want to get unclean by associating with sinners. Jesus is the ultimate Holy One. What does the Holy One do? He brings himself into the unholiness of the world in order to transform it. So sometimes even the best of us get the opposite effect. We get brought down by the unholiness of the world. But that doesn't mean that there's still holiness. Still, there's not holiness. That doesn't mean that Jesus abandoned his church. He never would have founded the thing in the first place if he knew it was going to fail. He knew Peter was going to deny him. He knew the apostles were all going to run away. Yet he said, "You're my rock, and on my rock I will build this church, even though I know you're a bumbling fool. I know it. And yet, nevertheless, I am going to use you, and not just you, but all your successors after you, to transcend you." Because the church isn't about you, Peter, or you, Paul, or you, John, or you, David, or Peter, Matthew. The church is about me working through you guys and you gals. That's really what the church is all about. Try as we might to screw it up, and we've been trying as Christians for 2,000 years, God still is resilient. We would have killed this institution a long, long time ago if the Holy Spirit weren't behind this. I mean, we could read we see the scandals, we know they're there. You can't ignore them. Just the fact that the church is still here tells us something. Yeah. There's got to be something divine behind this, otherwise it just wouldn't survive.
I'm reminded of the observation that I think the late Archbishop Rummel of, I think it was New Orleans, when someone asked him what was the greatest proof of the divinity of the Catholic Church, and he said, the idiots who run her.
Yes.
But Christine has another question, and it's, aside from reason, another aspect that makes secularism so attractive to so many appears to be that it's colorful and attention-catching. Meanwhile, the church seems to be stuck in a more rational and reasoning position only. Don't you think beauty should be given a bigger role too? It's time that we put more focus on redeeming beauty in the world, isn't it? That's something, of course, that Bishop Robert Barron has been talking about for a long time. It's something that Hans Urs von Balthasar and others have been making. But I see, Pete, your thumbs up, so we'll toss this to you.
Sure. Well, it goes with the narrative, right? You have to be able to tell a convincing story. You have to be able to present something that is good, beautiful, and true, right? And ultimately, if they look over at us and see us just constantly complaining about politics or complaining about the the culture or complaining about how we're shut out and how it used to be so much better for us. That's not the kind of thing that's going to draw them to us unless they already agree with us anyway. It really is seeing the glory, right? Seeing the truth, seeing the beauty. Maybe if we got back into doing art again, and movies and theater and film and stained glass windows and all that as a means really of capturing the story and telling stories that are good and beautiful and true, that might have much more of an effect than we think in terms of winning people over than simply these sorts of arguments. And again, I think that there's a really profound truth in what Christina asked there, and I agree with it very, very deeply. I think I think we were hoping to kind of unleash this great wave of truth and beauty upon the world in the last 100 years or so, but I'm still kind of waiting to see it. I mean, the churches we build today, are oftentimes not beautiful. The music we sing is not all that beautiful. The artwork that we produce, it's nothing compared to what we used to do. And I think in some ways we need to ultimately reclaim our pedigree, and that is in some sense, an essence of Catholicism, the cultural Catholicism, the high liturgy. I know David's in the liturgy too. I didn't read all through the books. I'm not sure if he talked much about liturgy, but capturing the liturgical beauty, the mystery, the sense of the sacred, that sort of je ne sais quoi, the thing you can't really touch, but you can see it and you can smell it and you can live it and you experience it.
In
In
a
some
sense,
ways, that
too,
is much more powerful than getting on Fox News and complaining about the war on Christmas or something like that, which I think we hear a lot of, and I think that I think that kind of approach has probably attracted about as many people as it's going to attract, and I think it's probably now it's time to move on from that.
But it's also in some ways allowing ourselves to be defined almost using secular terms within culture. So I'm reminded of, and this, David, this is for you, the vision that we have of that which is transcendent.
I mean, that's the whole, and that's the strength of our argument. To go back to the prior question we had a few minutes ago about what can we say, to go on offense, and it's pushing those questions to the secularists. It's pushing the questions of meaning, right? Is what we have in front of us the immanent, IMMANENT, is what's in front of it. It just doesn't answer all of our questions. It doesn't speak to human love. It doesn't speak to the innate desire in us to worship and to sacrifice for another. The transcendent, that which cuts through the immanent, what's in front of us, and brings us up to God. That's where we want to go. That's the whole purpose of faith. Faith brings us into a personal relationship with God that has it's lived under a veil here, but has its fulfillment on the other side of the divide after we die. That's the goal of faith, and that's where we ultimately want to keep our energy. So more of the book is devoted to that question, to the nature of faith and how we ought to live it out, rather than to questions of secularism and politics and other sorts of things.
Right. Well, it's interesting that we're talking about, are we going to use secular terms and concepts to try to spin the argument, to twist the argument, or in other words, to refute it? And toward that end, I think David, Anthony, has a great question. He says, do you think using utilitarian moral arguments are wise? For example, pointing out that abortion is not just killing a child, but killing off all their possible progeny in a preemptive genocide of a branch of the human race. I find this does get attention in high school classrooms. They do not think about that, but is it a wise argument to use? So I guess the wider question is, as we're sort of winding down here, I have a couple more questions as we're finishing up, but how carefully do we have to use secular arguments in order to defeat the secular cause?
I think it's always good to beat them on their own turf, and certainly you need to use vocabulary that people will understand. I'll
Yeah.
give you, for instance, one of my pet peeves is a nomenclature change that we've all done, is to shift away from using the term morals, instead use the term values. Morals sound like right and wrong, something that's a commandment that makes us feel uncomfortable these days. Value sounds so much kinder. But what about values? Values are random, right? My house might be valued at X value this year and another value 10 years from now. Values shift. They're relative. They don't have anything fixed in them. So we have to be careful when we should use their vocabulary, because we have to be able to bring them in. So to use, say, utilitarian argument is good to get attention, but we have to then be able to somehow bring the argument back to our vocabulary and our turf. We have to be teaching that as we go. We can't just use the terms and expect people to understand. Included in the back of the book, a glossary for all of the philosophical terms and the basic terms of things like faith and grace, nature, empiricism. What do these terms all mean? So they're all there in one spot. Eventually, we need, because I think the most compelling arguments that can be made, the ones that deal with the true meaning of the human person and that get to beauty and truth, are the Catholic ones and not the secular ones. Yeah. So we could start with those words, but we need to use those words to steer the conversation back to our ground and our perspective.
Yeah. Pete, anything to add to that real quick?
That's a really good point. I agree with what David said wholeheartedly. I think one of the reasons, young people, that is, say, the millennial generation and even the generation coming up, that they tend to be a little bit more receptive to anti-abortion arguments than they had been in the past, is that they can innately grasp the concept of human rights and, the violation of human rights. But the problem is that script sort of gets flipped on you when you start talking about, gay marriage and other sorts of things, because the human rights frame is one that is kind of owned by the pro-gay rights, gay marriage side on that, and so they tend not to get it as readily. And so I don't know. I mean, I think the problem with using these concepts such as human rights and even the dignity of the human person, which has been sort of a concept that the church has co-opted, in some ways started, but in some ways co-opted. There's some good aspects to it for sure, but there's also some problems with it too. And I think we're beginning to see what some of those problems are, in that it really, the concepts themselves have a provenance themselves that sort of presupposes a lot of things about a kind of a Christian view of the world and a Christian view of the created order that don't necessarily obtain to all the people who use that terminology. And so there is a problem with just using those kinds of terminology. Now, again, if you're just trying to persuade people to oppose abortion, that's one thing, but that's that in some ways is an issue that's in some way kind of downstream from the more fundamental issue of trying to save the world and trying to redeem the world for God and Jesus, right? So and to really get to those areas, you've got to get way beyond the language of human rights and human dignity and begin to talk about God and Jesus and plan of salvation.
And can we say, much as it was true in the times of the Roman Empire and the great persecutions, that it is very much true today that the Christians, how they love one another. And
right.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Well, we are sadly just about out of time, so I want to pose one last very brief question to both of you, and that is that can we turn this around? Are you optimists that in fact we will be able to rebuild a concept of a Christian civilization and refute secularism in a way that will ultimately be meaningful?
Great question. The martyrs are an interesting example because we always think of them in terms of faith, but when we think of them in terms of the world, they fail. In the eyes of the world, the martyrs are complete and utter failures. They give up their life, they give up whatever it is they stand for, and they are killed at the hands of other people. They look like losers. But in our eyes, they're winners because they saw the bigger prize that lies beyond the horizon that their executioners couldn't see. So I think for us today, I think there's some truth to that, in that I think in the near term, there's going to be more losses than there are going to be victories. And we have to be willing as Catholics to be losers in the martyr sense of the term. We have to be willing to lose points, lose standing in the eyes of the world, if that's going to be what it takes to build the kingdom of God. So it may mean that the churches in America are going to close. It's happening already. It's probably going to continue to be the case. The near term probably isn't overwhelmingly positive as far as worldly stuff, but we have to keep our eyes on the prize and realize that losing to the world doesn't necessarily entail losing to God. Somehow we have to find a way to lose to the world, but yet win for God, and that's the challenge. And it may be through ways that we haven't even seen before, in terms of losing material prosperity, losing physical churches, and other sorts of cultural things that we've had as Catholics for so many centuries now. We may be losing some of those things. But nevertheless,
here we have the joy of the cross as a sign of contradiction.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, that's going to have to do it for us this evening, gentlemen, and for all of you who joined us this evening. David's book, Steadfast in Faith, Catholicism, and the Challenges of Secularism, but also David and both of you, what are you teaching right now that our audience would be interested in studying at the Catholic Distance University? David?
Well, right now, the Sacraments course this is its final week, and on the BA level, they are, I don't know if my students are listening on the webinar right now, but they have their final exam that's due on by the 5th. So that'll be coming to a close. That's my main course at CDU, is the Sacraments on the BA level.
All right. And Pete?
Salvation history coming up in May.
All right. So for those of you who would be interested in what the CDU at the Catholic Distance University has to offer by way of our programs, certificates, undergraduate programs, and graduate programs, go to cdu.edu for a lot more information, and we hope that you will. Well, that finishes our discussion tonight on secularism and faith. I'm very grateful to David Bonagura, professor at CDU, as well as St. Joseph Seminary, and of course our redoubtable dean, Dr. Peter Brown, and scripture scholar. And my thanks especially to all of you who took part tonight. Thank you for the excellent questions. It was a great conversation all the way around. I'm Matthew Bunson. On behalf of the Catholic Distance University of CDU Presents, thank you so much for joining us tonight. But also, we pray that you will have a blessed Lent and a truly extraordinary experience over the days to come. Please stay tuned for more webinars in the future, as well as a couple of other interesting developments that will be coming our way in terms of exploring the faith with the Catholic Distance University. Again, if you'd like more information about our course offerings and opportunities to study, go to cdu.edu. Until next time, take care and God bless.